Hey guys, tonight we set off into the cool hush of the medieval night, lantern in hand, the stones beneath your boots still warm from the sun that dipped away hours ago. The air feels thick with secrets, and you can almost hear the walls themselves whispering. You stand before an old fortress, its towers jagged against the moonlight, and you know this is no ordinary story. This is about myths, fantastical tales once dismissed as bedtime fables that turned out to have far more truth tucked inside than anyone expected. And just a fair warning, you probably won't survive this if you're allergic to dust, because the amount of crumbling parchment and cobwebbed staircases ahead is legendary. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to make things more fun, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward through the looming gatehouse where guards once stood stiffly with halberds, watching for trouble. People long believed that castles were nothing more than oversized fairy tale props, elaborate backdrops for knights, dragons, and damsels. Yet the stones tell another story. Archaeologists have unearthed secret passages that really do twist through the walls. Tunnels designed not for fantasy novels but for smuggling, spying, or just sneaking out when the banquet food gave you indigestion. Imagine the thrill of finding that tiny spiral staircase hidden behind a bookshelf. Suddenly, the legend of the castle that swallowed men whole doesn't sound so far-fetched. The mainstream fact here is this: many castles had intricate defensive features like murder holes, yes, real architectural vultsumas, ents where defenders could dump boiling oil or rocks on attackers. No wonder later storytellers said castles themselves seemed alive and malevolent. That detail makes the whole myth of cursed fortresses eerily plausible. You stand beneath one such slit in the ceiling, imagining some poor medieval foot soldier realizing too late that gravity and boiling tar were not his friends. But there's a quirky tidbit you don't often hear. Some castles had indoor bathrooms that emptied straight down the walls. Picture it, a king on his throne. No, not that throne, the other one, unknowingly creating what peasants later called haunted moans, echoing from the stone. You'd almost expect a Scooby-Doo chase sequence to follow. The myth of castles literally groaning. Turns out it might have just been very unfortunate plumbing. As you walk deeper into the fortress, your hand trailing along the cold walls, you feel the past pressing close. The myths of castles that disappeared overnight have roots in reality too. During sieges, some lords dismantled wooden fortresses and carted them away, leaving baffled travelers to report that a castle had stood one day, and the next it was gone, as if swallowed by the earth. Historians still argue whether one such tale in Wales described a mirage, a movable fort, or something even stranger. The flicker of your torch catches on carved stone faces, grotesques, twisted in mid-laugh. People once believed these statues could speak, warning defenders of danger. Ridiculous? Maybe. But in 2010, researchers discovered cleverly designed echo chambers that projected voices through stone corridors. A whispered warning could travel like magic, bouncing around until it seemed the wall itself was speaking. Suddenly, the myth doesn't feel like a lie, just a slightly embellished version of a clever sound trick. You climb a staircase, each step worn down by countless boots, and the myths cling tighter. Travelers once wrote about castles where walls wept water, seeping like tears. That might sound like a Gothic metaphor, but you run your fingers along damp stone and realize the phenomenon of condensation in poorly ventilated masonry was all too real. Imagine being a peasant, seeing a fortress crying in the moonlight. You'd run back to your village, certain the devil lived upstairs. As the hour drifts deeper into the night, you pause by a window slit and look over the darkened countryside. From here, lords once watched enemy armies, but also perhaps strange lights flickering across the hills. Chroniclers wrote of castles haunted by phantom armies. Historians suspect these were marsh lights, ignited gases rising from boggy ground, but when you're staring across a misty valley and see dozens of glowing orbs bobbing in silence, you're not thinking about chemistry. You're thinking, well, time to sprint the other way. You trace onward to the Great Hall. Here, myths and truths mingle most thickly. The enormous hearth roared with fire, and tales said flames once rose green when witches cursed the castle. Modern scientists tell you copper salts in the wood caused it, but come on, admit it, green flames still sound way cooler than oops chemistry. The castle hums with all these layers, practical defenses that seemed magical, plumbing that echoed into ghost stories, light tricks that birthed legends. You can't help but smirk. Medieval people weren't gullible fools, they were just trying to explain the bizarre world around them with the language they had. And you're standing in the middle of those whispers, knowing that sometimes myths survive precisely because they were almost true. The night stretches on, and your journey through myth-wrapped fortresses continues. You move quietly because who knows, maybe one of those grotesque faces will finally lean down and whisper back. You shuffle onward from the Great Hall, following a corridor that tightens like a throat. The air grows cooler, and the sound of your own footsteps becomes the only music. Tonight you're not simply wandering stone halls, you're stepping into the myths of knights themselves, those rusted heroes of romance ballads. You've heard the stories, men in armor who were impossible to pierce, clanking gods of war who rode through storms of arrows without a scratch. And yet, beneath the exaggeration, something stubbornly true lingers. You imagine yourself at a medieval tournament, banners snapping in the wind, spectators shrieking like a modern sports crowd. Knights gallop into the lists, their plate armor glittering, the mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, full suits of plate armor really were astonishingly effective. A skilled archer might pepper a knight all day and barely dent the surface. Metallurgists forged steel strong enough to stop most slashing blows, and that's where the myth of indestructible knights first caught fire. But let's add a quirky tidbit. Knights in full armor weren't the stiff tin can caricatures you see in cartoons. Tests with real suits have shown you could still run, climb, and even perform cartwheels if you had enough balance. Imagine a heavily armed warrior breaking into gymnastics mid-battle. Now that's a recruitment poster. It gives you a grin to think of peasants watching knights tumble through drills and mistaking them for supernatural beings. Still, the myths stretched farther. Chroniclers whispered of knights whose armor turned blades aside as if enchanted, and of warriors who never seemed to tire. The secret layers. Beneath the armor was padded cloth called a gambeson, soaking up impact. You slap your hand against your chest, imagining the dull thump of a mace landing and not cracking your ribs. To an onlooker it seemed impossible, like the man inside was bulletproof centuries before bullets. Historians still argue whether common soldiers truly believed knights were protected by sorcery, or whether that was just the clever propaganda of noble families. You picture yourself trudging across a battlefield, mud sucking at your boots, watching a knight gleam like a walking statue. The myths claimed knights drowned if they fell into water, too heavy to rise again. It sounds ridiculous, but try balancing 60 pounds of shifting steel in a river current. Suddenly it's less a myth and more a tragic slapstick reality. The rumor grew until villagers believed any knight in armor was fated to sink like a cursed stone. You almost laugh, imagining medieval lifeguards sprinting with ropes whenever a joust wandered too close to a pond. As you drift through the armory, you run your hand along pitted helms, noticing how narrow the vision slits were. Myths said knights could see through darkness, but in truth, the small openings forced them to develop uncanny focus. Picture peering through a mail slot at chaos and somehow managing to aim a lance at a charging foe. From the outside, it looked like superhuman precision. From the inside, it was squinting until your eyes watered. And here's another eerie fragment. Some suits were so well fitted they might as well have been second skins. When such armor was unearthed centuries later, the stories practically wrote themselves. Skeletons of Iron Men were reported in old newspapers, fueling ideas that knights were literally half machine. The myth of mechanical warriors wasn't just early science fiction, it was people trying to explain why these rusting shells looked like no human could have possibly worn them. You stroll further, past racks of weapons. Imagine a knight gripping a longsword, that elegant icon of chivalry. Myths say swords clashed forever without breaking, ringing like church bells. In reality, swords often bent, chipped, or even snapped, but smiths did craft blades with flexible cores, allowing them to bend back into shape, an engineering marvel so rare it seemed enchanted. That's how tales of unbreakable weapons gained traction. You can almost hear the clang now, echoing across the ages, mingling fact and fantasy. You pause before a faded tapestry showing knights kneeling at a shrine. People believed knights were guided by divine visions, their battles chosen by heavenly mandate. Some claimed glowing crosses appeared before their armies. Skeptics today shrug and point to weather phenomena like sun halos. Still, stand in a battlefield haze, dust blurring your vision, and watch sunlight refract around your helm. You'd probably think the same thing. Divine endorsement right this way. Your torchlight glints on a gauntlet lying abandoned in the corner. You imagine slipping your hand inside, feeling its surprising flexibility. The myth said a knight's handshake could crush bones. Not entirely false, steel gauntlets added quite a punch. Shake one too firmly and you might limp away nursing your fingers, muttering that the man was part giant. You step back, the clang of echoes ringing in your ears. The truth of knights was already impressive. Steel artistry, engineering genius, and psychological warfare wrapped into one. No sorcery required. But when peasants gazed up at a mounted knight glimmering like a silver statue under a stormy sky, can you really blame them for spinning the myth that humans had become something more? The corridor bends again, leading you deeper into the fortress where new creatures wait in the shadows. Somewhere ahead, the faint scrape of claw against stone stirs another old legend. Dragons, anyone. You edge deeper into the fortress, your torch sputtering as a draft snakes through cracks in the walls. The sound that drew your attention, scratch, scratch, fades into silence. You pause, letting the quiet settle until your mind fills with images of beasts no sane person would want to meet in the dark. Dragons, enormous fire-breathing lizards with scales harder than steel and appetites larger than castles themselves. You've seen them in movies, perched on mountains, wings unfurling. But here, in the candle-smudged manuscripts of medieval monks, the dragons feel closer, scratched into margins, scrawled between prayers, like the doodles of scribes who'd seen something they couldn't quite explain. The mainstream fact first, medieval manuscripts are absolutely littered with depictions of dragons. Some coil around page borders, others swallow knights whole, and many serve as illustrations in bestiaries, those half-zoology, half-myth guidebooks of the Middle Ages. You lean over one such imagined page now, the ink line still sharp centuries later. But here's the kicker. Some drawings bear striking resemblance to real animals. The dragon with a ridged back and long snout, crocodile. The fire breather with a sack-like pouch in its throat. Likely inspired by descriptions of monitor lizards spitting venom. Suddenly the distance between fantasy and fact shrinks to almost nothing. Still, myths grew wings, literally. Dragons in European lore often sprouted vast leathery wings, blotting out the sun. Were they purely imagination? Maybe not. Think of medieval villagers stumbling across fossilized pterosaur bones eroding from a hillside. To them, these weren't the petrified remains of an extinct species. They were proof that somewhere, somehow, flying monsters once ruled the skies. Historians still argue whether early reports of dragon skeletons were mistaken fossils or misidentified whale bones hauled inland by trade. Either way, you can picture a wide-eyed farmer holding a massive jawbone and whispering, "By God, we've found the beast." The quirky tidbit. In some parts of Europe, dragon bones were ground up into powders and sold as cures for everything from headaches to impotence. Imagine the medieval apothecary grinding away at what we now know was probably mammoth ivory, muttering, "Yep, guaranteed to improve your aim at the archery range." You almost smirk at the thought of someone paying good coin for fossilized triceratops dust in a little cloth pouch. You continue down the damp passage and the scratch of claws echoes again, louder this time. Your imagination conjures wings scraping stone. The medieval mind did the same. Many castles and villages kept dragon myths alive to explain real dangers. Smoke rolling from volcanoes or rivers that vanished underground and swallowed people whole. Dragons became shorthand for the unknowable forces of nature. The volcano belched smoke, clearly a dragon snoring under the mountain. A sudden flash flood carried off livestock. The dragon was thirsty that day. Historians still argue whether medieval dragon myths were simply metaphors for chaos or whether they preserved fragmented folk memories of encounters with genuinely strange animals. Think of Nile crocodiles smuggled north by exotic animal traders, or sailors' garbled descriptions of Komodo dragons from distant islands. By the time the stories reached Paris or Prague, the reptiles had wings, breath of fire, and a bad attitude. You step into a chamber lit by moonlight slicing through narrow slits. On the wall, a faded fresco shows St. George spearing a dragon. The myth says he saved a princess from being eaten, but if you look closer, the dragon resembles a giant snake, maybe an oversized python. Europe had no native pythons, of course, but merchants brought them alive or dead into Mediterranean ports. Imagine the panic when someone spotted a 20-foot snake rolling in a cargo hold. No wonder the tale turned into knights battling dragons. And then there's fire. Always the fire. Could any animal breathe it? The rational answer is no, yet nature does offer a weird parallel, the bombardier beetle which sprays boiling chemicals in defense. To a medieval naturalist hearing of such a creature, why not imagine a lizard doing the same on a grander scale? Add in the sulphurous stink from caves near volcanic vents, and suddenly you've got a beast belching smoke. A stretch, sure, but not as far-fetched as it seems in hindsight. The torchlight dances across stone, and for a moment you swear you see a shadow unfurl wings on the wall. That's the power of dragon myths. They cling, they exaggerate, but they're always anchored in something tangible. You can almost hear the hush of villagers gathering around a storyteller's fire, holding their breath as he swears he saw claw marks near the riverbank or watched scales glimmer in moonlight. And here's a little joke whispered through time. Medieval bestiaries claimed dragon fat could melt metal. You chuckle, because if you've ever cleaned bacon grease out of a pan, you know it melts your patience, if nothing else. The myth carried on, though, because metallurgists noticed that certain animal fats did affect smelting fires. So yes, maybe not dragon fat, but pig lard did some heavy lifting in forging. The chamber grows quiet again, and you let the silence sink in. The myths of dragons weren't just bedtime tales, they were an attempt to stitch reality and wonder together. Fossils, foreign animals, natural disasters, all knitted into one enormous winged symbol of fear and awe. And as you step forward, leaving claw marks and scales behind, you can't help but feel the next set of myths waiting in the shadows, saints and relics that moved across Europe like restless ghosts. You push deeper into the castle's winding arteries, past another iron-bound door, and emerge into a room that smells faintly of wax and incense. The walls are lined with wooden shelves sagging under the weight of boxes, reliquaries, and jars. Some shimmer faintly with gilt paint, others are cracked, spilling pale bones onto dusty cushions. This is where faith and myth intermingle most dangerously, because tonight you're following the tales of wandering saints, those holy men and women who were said to travel the continent long after their deaths, carried piece by piece to churches desperate for prestige. You can almost hear the monks chanting, voices rising like fog. The mainstream fact here is simple. Relics were everything in the medieval world. A single saint's finger bone could draw pilgrims by the thousands, bringing both devotion and coin to whichever abbey housed it. That's why myths sprang up of relics that moved on their own, choosing their rightful resting place. Villagers swore they saw wagons grind to a halt until the bones were taken to a specific church. Sounds like legend? Maybe. But we have written accounts of oxen refusing to move while carrying sacred remains, so strong was the belief that even the animals joined in. You trail your hand over one reliquary shaped like a golden arm. Inside, a humerus rattles faintly. Imagine the medieval peasant kneeling before this glittering vessel, convinced that touching it could cure blindness or plague. Quirky tidbit. Sometimes it actually did help. Not miraculously, but through the placebo effect, or the fact that a pilgrimage meant clean air, rest, and fresh water. People returned home healthier, convinced the saint had intervened. You can't help but smile at the irony. Modern science nods, medieval myth beams smugly, and the pilgrim just thanks Saint whoever. Still, the myths wander stranger roads. Some saints were said to walk posthumously, their coffins too restless to stay put. In Spain, there are tales of coffins that floated upstream, guided by divine will. Historians still argue whether these stories were symbolic or whether floods really carried coffins to odd resting spots, later retold with holy embellishment. Picture villagers watching a coffin bobbing stubbornly against the current. Yeah, you'd probably assume divine GPS at work. You kneel beside a chest marked with faint Latin letters. Inside lies a skull, jawbone crooked, teeth missing. One legend claimed such relics could speak prophecies if the faithful listened closely enough. Creepy? Absolutely. But again, reality has an odd echo. In some cases, gases trapped in sealed coffins escaped with faint whistles when opened, sounding disturbingly like murmured words. Imagine a monk fumbling with a crowbar, a hiss escaping and half the room falling to their knees in awe. As you step further, the myths grow richer. The cult of Saint Catherine of Alexandria told that angels carried her body to Mount Sinai. Later, her relics were displayed there, and pilgrims reported sweet-smelling oil dripping from her bones. Myth, miracle, or just a natural secretion from decaying material in desert heat? Scholars still debate, but you imagine kneeling in that dry, baking air, smelling rose-scented oil on bone, and deciding the myth must be true. The candlelight flickers over another reliquary shaped like a foot, toes painted bright red. Here's where myth really hit marketing genius. Whole pilgrimages formed around single toes, thumbs, or scraps of cloth. The more bizarre, the more attractive. Some relics were proven authentic centuries later. Analysis of the Shroud of Turin shows it's medieval in construction, but tiny traces of pollen match plants found only in the Middle East. Half-truth, half-legend, exactly the cocktail medio Valfaith thrived on. A quirky aside for you, there were sometimes duplicate relics, dozens of them. At one point, over 30 churches claimed to have the head of John the Baptist. Jokingly, historians say he must have been a hydra, but the myth persisted because pilgrims needed to believe their town's relic was the true one, so the stories multiplied like rabbits. And why not? If you were a medieval innkeeper making bank from weary pilgrims, you'd happily swear your relic glowed in the moonlight too. The chamber grows colder, and you move toward an altar where relics were once displayed under coloured glass. Imagine the light streaming down, illuminating dust motes that looked like tiny angels. Monks would claim the saint himself was present, and while skeptics today chalk it up to atmosphere, the psychological pull was undeniable. Belief itself carved reality so that the myth became real in the minds of the faithful. The scholarly debate rages even now. Did relics actually move from city to city by miracle, or were they stolen, sold, and quietly rebranded? Evidence shows both. Monks sometimes crept in at night, translating relics with the stealth of jewel thieves, only to later insist the saint desired a new home. To a medieval villager, it wasn't theft, it was destiny. You chuckle softly to yourself. Imagine someone trying to pull that stunt today. Sorry, officer, I didn't steal the Ferrari chose me. Yet, in the Middle Ages, that logic sailed through unchallenged. The relics wanted what they wanted. You sit for a moment on a stone bench, letting the myths settle like dust in the air. Saints who travelled after death, coffins that floated upstream, skulls that whispered, bones that wept oil. All myths, yes, but each with a strand of reality woven in, binding faith to the everyday. And you, weary traveller, are left to wonder if maybe the bones still shift in the dark, longing for another journey. Somewhere down the corridor a faint rustle stirs again, this time not claws, a softer sound like voices whispering spells. You rise slowly. Ahead lies the world of witches and wise women where myth and medicine meet under the moon. You move toward the sound, deeper into the winding maze of stone. The torchlight falters, painting shadows that seem to curl and stretch like long fingers across the wall. Your ears catch the faint hum of voices, low, steady, almost like the chanting of women gathered under a pale moon. Tonight, the myths of witches and wise women stir awake, pulling you into their cauldron of stories. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Medieval Europe was filled with women and some men who practiced herbal medicine, midwifery, and rituals passed down through generations. To their neighbours, these were wise women, healers who knew which roots calmed a fever or which leaves eased childbirth pains. But when illness spread too widely or crops failed, suspicion twisted those helpful figures into dangerous ones. Suddenly the woman with jars of dried plants became a witch with poisons. The healer's chants over a birthing bed became incantations to the devil. Picture yourself standing outside a thatched cottage. Smoke drifts from the chimney, carrying the scent of rosemary and sage. Inside, a woman crushes herbs with a pestle, her hands stained green. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists have found amulets and carved charms buried near such homes, suggesting that even while villagers whispered "witch," they also came knocking for cures. It's the medieval version of hating your neighbor yet still borrowing sugar. The myths, though, grew stranger. Tales spread of witches flying on broomsticks through stormy skies. Historians still argue whether this image came from hallucinogenic ointments applied to broom handles, absorbed through the skin to induce visions, or whether it was just a convenient way for storytellers to describe women riding the night. Imagine the scene. A villager glimpses a woman running through fields with her broom at midnight, maybe chasing livestock, and by sunrise the story has her circling the moon. The cauldron myth also lingers here. You picture women hunched over bubbling pots, stirring with long spoons, chanting rhymes. In reality, most of these cauldrons were simply for brewing medicinal teas. A concoction of willow bark, for instance, contained the same chemical we now know as aspirin, but to a suspicious neighbor hearing odd smells and mutters at midnight, that wasn't medicine, that was witchcraft. And when the fever broke the next morning, well, clearly the spell had worked. You step through a doorway into a smaller chamber where shelves sag beneath jars of dried plants. The air smells earthy, musty, like an apothecary's shop. A legend claimed witches could summon storms with their brews. Yet records show that certain herbs, when burned, released smoke that repelled insects or masked smells. Useful, not demonic. Still, when clouds rolled in, just as the smoke curled skyward, the myth of weather-working witches caught fire. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed in night flights and Sabbaths where witches danced with devils, or whether these stories were propaganda spread by church authorities to justify crackdowns. Some scholars see them as exaggerated confessions coaxed under torture, but fragments of truth lie underneath. Folk gatherings around bonfires, women singing and drumming to mark seasonal changes, rituals that were harmless until the wrong pair of eyes spied them. You crouch beside a broken mortar on the floor. Imagine a woman grinding henbane seeds here, an actual hallucinogenic herb used in small doses as a sedative. Too much could cause visions, tremors, and delirium. The villagers who saw her client stumble home laughing or weeping claimed she had bewitched them. Science would later call it alkaloid poisoning. In the dim torchlight, though, it looks like enchantment. The myths reached further. Cats became accused companions, familiars of witches. The black cat crossing your path. Pure medieval paranoia. But quirky detail. During plague years, cats were sometimes slaughtered en masse, believed to be agents of witches. Ironically, fewer cats meant more rats, which meant more fleas spreading plague. The myth of witches' cats, in a roundabout way, worsened the very horrors people hoped to avoid. You can almost hear the sarcastic whisper, "Great plan, everyone. Burn the cat, keep the plague." Another eerie whisper. Witches were said to turn into animals, slipping into wolf skins or owl feathers to spy on villages. Reality check. People probably saw herbalists wearing cloaks lined with animal hides, or they noticed women moving silently through forests at night to collect plants. In the right moonlight, shadows stretched animal-like, and a myth was born. You pass into a narrow stairwell, stone steps spiraling upward. Every creak feels like the hiss of unseen women laughing in the dark. The myths claimed witches rode storms, summoned hail, even soured milk with a glance. But you know spoiled milk happens when storage goes wrong. Still, tell that to a farmer who watched his only cow fail after a strange woman visited. That myth travelled faster than the milk soured. Scholars still debate the infamous witches' Sabbath. Was it ever real, or just an invention of interrogators? The myth says women flew to mountaintops, danced naked. and feasted with demons, but in reality village records show communal gatherings on holy days, festivals with food, song and bonfires. To suspicious eyes, merrymaking became blasphemy. One last quirky note before you leave this shadowed chamber. A medieval witch bottle was sometimes buried under doorsteps, filled with pins, hair and urine to trap curses. Archaeologists still find them today, glass-sealed for centuries. Imagine stepping over one unknowingly, the myth literally under your feet, still waiting to snag an unwary spirit. You breathe out slowly, the torch dimming. The myths of witches weren't just about fear, they were about control. They took real women, real healers, and turned them into shadows of terror. Yet in their jars, their roots, their whispered charms, much of the myth was true. They did hold knowledge that could heal or harm, depending on the dose. The stairwell curls upward, and you climb, each step groaning like a tired spell. Ahead, another myth waits. Kings who refused to die, rulers slumbering in hidden mountains, their stories echoing into the present. The staircase groans beneath you as you climb, spiraling higher until the torchlight spills into a vaulted chamber. The air is cool here, tinged with the faint scent of moss, as if the stones themselves have been sleeping for centuries. You pause, breathing in that stillness, and the stories of kings who never died stir awake. In medieval Europe, rulers often outlived themselves in myth, becoming half-immortal figures who supposedly slumbered in caves or mountains, waiting for the right time to rise again. Tonight you step quietly into their restless dreams. The mainstream fact first, many medieval cultures cultivated sleeping king legends. The most famous in England was King Arthur, who, according to folklore, didn't die but was carried to the mystical Isle of Avalon. Chronicles from the 12th century onward repeated this with such insistence that even centuries later, soldiers swore Arthur would return in Britain's hour of greatest need. You lean against the stone wall, imagining a whole nation clinging to the myth of a king who might reappear just when hope seemed lost. And Arthur wasn't alone. In Germany, people whispered of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa slumbering in a hidden mountain, his red beard growing through the stone table as he dreamed. They said when ravens no longer circled the peak, he would awaken and restore his empire. Historians still argue whether these stories grew from pagan myths of gods bound beneath hills, or whether people simply couldn't bear the idea of such rulers ever truly dying. Either way, the myth of the never-dead king became a cornerstone of medieval imagination. You picture villagers gathering around fires, voices hushed as they retold the tale. "The king is not gone," someone would whisper, "he only sleeps." Quirky tidbit: caves thought to contain these slumbering rulers often became pilgrimage sites. In Austria, there's a cavern where people left offerings, bread, coins, even children's toys, believing they were gifts for Barbarossa himself. Imagine climbing into a damp, echoing cavern, leaving a crust of bread on a rock, and tiptoeing out so you wouldn't wake the king too soon. But myths sometimes leave tangible marks. In Britain, the Abbey of Glastonbury claimed in the 12th century to have found the grave of Arthur and Guinevere. They unearthed coffins with inscriptions naming the legendary pair. Was it a hoax? Many scholars think so, designed to boost pilgrim tourism after a fire. Yet others argue the abbey really did stumble across a grave that had inspired the legends in the first place. Even now, archaeologists debate whether Arthur was a singular historical figure, a composite of several warlords, or purely myth. You sigh. Historians still argue, and maybe they always will. The chamber around you hums with the weight of stories. Some kings were said to vanish rather than die. Olaf II of Norway, for example, was rumoured to have survived battle and gone into hiding, only to reappear later as a saint. People swore they saw him in distant villages decades after his supposed death. It's almost the medieval version of Elvis sightings. Once a figure becomes larger than life, death feels optional. You move toward a stone dais at the center of the chamber. Dust lies thick on its surface, but in your mind's eye you see a king stretched upon it, crown tilted, chest rising with slow, enchanted breaths. Another myth claimed Charlemagne himself rested beneath the cathedral at Aachen, seated on his throne, eyes closed, sword across his lap. When the Emperor Otto allegedly discovered him centuries later, Charlemagne's body looked untouched, as though he had simply nodded off. Whether true or not, the story reinforced the myth. Kings did not rot, they waited. The quirky detail here, these sleeping kings were sometimes blamed for natural phenomena. A rumble of thunder near a mountain might be explained as the monarch turning in his slumber, a tremor shaking a valley. Clearly the king stirred uneasily, almost ready to rise. Imagine huddling in a cottage, beams creaking, while your grandmother mutters, "Hush now." Barbarossa rolls in his sleep. You'd probably believe it too. The myths weren't always comforting. In some regions, the return of the sleeping king meant apocalypse, not salvation. King Arthur, in some Welsh tales, would rise only at the end of days when the world cracked open. Frederick Barbarossa, in darker retellings, would awaken to wage one final terrible war. Historians point out that these stories were flexible, tailored to the needs of each century. A hopeful age made the king a savior, a fearful one turned him into a harbinger of doom. You brush dust off the dais, half expecting to hear a snore. These myths linger because they answer a timeless longing, the refusal to let heroes go. People wanted to believe their greatest rulers weren't gone, merely waiting. Even now, the myth resurfaces in popular culture. Arthur sleeping, Tolkien's Aragorn echoing the same archetype. Even modern leaders whispered about as if they'll come back one day. As your torch sputters lower, you notice faint carvings along the chamber wall. They look like ravens etched in stone, wings spread wide. A reminder of Barbarossa's mountain, perhaps. You wonder, if the ravens flew away tonight, would the king rise beneath your feet? The thought curls around your mind like smoke, both eerie and oddly comforting. And then a soft sound, not a snore, not thunder, just a faint sigh from somewhere deeper in the fortress. You follow it, heart steady, feet quiet. The myths are guiding you now, pulling you toward fields once soaked in blood, where soldiers whispered of ghosts that never left. The haunted battlefields await. The sigh leads you downward again, down another set of worn stone steps into the belly of the fortress. The air grows colder, sharper, tinged with iron and damp earth. You feel the weight of centuries pressing down, and you know what waits here. Battlefields, places where blood once soaked the ground so deeply that legends claimed the soil itself remembered. Tonight you walk those haunted fields where myths of ghostly soldiers mingle with real discoveries of bones, armor, and echoes that refuse to fade. The mainstream fact: medieval Europe was drenched in wars, dynastic struggles, holy crusades, local feuds that boiled over into slaughter. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves near battlefields like Towton in England, 1461, where over 40,000 men clashed in a single day. Skeletons there bear brutal marks of sword, arrow, and mace. It's no wonder survivors whispered that the fields were cursed, haunted by the restless dead. You kneel in the dark chamber, picturing rows of bones lying in silence beneath your feet, the real anchors of ghost stories. The myths grew wild. Chronicles tell of armies marching at night long after they were dead. In 1098, during the First Crusade at Antioch, starving crusaders claimed to see ghostly knights riding beside them, glowing with holy light. Some swore these were saints come to fight. Others thought they were the spirits of fallen comrades. Historians still argue whether it was mass hallucination, desperate propaganda, or something stranger. But stand in a battlefield mist after days of hunger, and you might see horse shapes in the fog too. Quirky tidbit. At Wisby in Gotland, 1361, archaeologists found bodies still wearing leather armor studded with coins, hurriedly buried in shallow pits. Local legends said the dead rattled in the earth, restless because their wealth was never claimed. Villagers avoided the spot for centuries. They're whispering that clinking sounds rose from the ground on windy nights. Maybe it was just shifting soil and loose metal, but imagine hearing coins jingle where no one stood. You'd run. You move into a larger chamber where murals once showed battles, now faded into ghostly smudges. The myths of haunted fields weren't just about fear. They were cautionary. Chroniclers wrote of phantom screams rising at dusk, warning future generations to tread lightly. At the site of the Battle of Agincourt, peasants claimed the ground steamed on cold mornings, as if the earth exhaled the pain of thousands. Science explains it. Decomposing organic matter warms soil. But when your field smokes at dawn, you don't think compost, you think ghosts. The eerie sound of dripping water echoes around you. It's almost like the soft tap of arrows striking shields. You smirk nervously at the thought. Medieval soldiers sometimes carried battlefield soil home in pouches, believing it held protective power. Myths said the soil remembered the clash and could shield the wearer. Archaeologists have found these tiny packets buried with men, proof that even hardened warriors believed in the magic of haunted earth. Historians still argue about the famous tale of the Black Army seen at Culloden centuries later, visions of ghost soldiers fighting eternally. Was it exaggeration, or did battlefields leave psychological imprints on locals who kept retelling the same spectral story? The debate continues, but the persistence of such legends suggests people really did feel something uncanny on those grounds. You kneel near a stone trough once used to wash wounds. Imagine soldiers scrubbing away blood only to swear later the basin refilled on its own, crimson rising again at night. Myths of bleeding ground and weeping stones are recorded from battle sites across Europe. Rationally, iron-rich soil mixing with groundwater, but emotionally, the idea that the land itself cried made perfect sense to a traumatized villager. Quirky note: after the Battle of Towton, people swore that snow on the fields turned pink every spring thaw. Centuries later, chemical tests showed high levels of iron oxide in the soil. Translation: the blood really did stain the earth long enough to feed the myth. You chuckle softly. Sometimes the creepiest legends come with footnotes in chemistry. As your torch flickers, shadows twist across the walls and you imagine ghostly ranks forming in silence, marching feet that never rest, breath fogging in cold air as phantom armies pass unseen. Whether hallucinations, trauma, or the human need to make sense of horror, the myths endure because they answer the unanswerable. How can so much death vanish without a trace? You stand, brushing dirt from your hands. The battlefield chamber hums as though listening. These ghost stories weren't just entertainment, they were the medieval version of therapy. They kept alive the memory of those lost, even if in distorted form, and you, walking now among the shadows, feel the weight of that memory pressing on your shoulders. The sighing you first heard has vanished, replaced now by faint scratching again, but not claws this time. A different sound, like quills on parchment scribbling by candlelight. Ahead lies the monk's domain, where maps were drawn that hinted at lands far beyond their time. The scratching grows louder as you press forward, until the narrow corridor opens into a chamber glowing faintly with golden dust motes. Here, long wooden tables stretch beneath arched windows, their surfaces littered with scraps of vellum, inkpots and quills hardened with centuries of neglect. You step lightly as though monks might still be bent over their desks, murmuring prayers while their hands glide across parchment. This is where myths of secret maps were born, legends claiming that medieval monks charted lands no one should have known existed, predictions that seemed impossible until centuries later. The mainstream historical fact: monks really were among the most skilled mapmakers of the medieval world. In monasteries from Ireland to Italy, scribes copied Roman texts, annotated them, and drew world maps, mapae mundi, that combined geography with theology. You lean over one ghostly outline etched into stone, noticing how Jerusalem sits neatly at the center. To medieval eyes, maps weren't just about land, they were about meaning. Every river and mountain carried moral weight, yet hidden inside some of these maps are details that raise eyebrows even today. Consider the Vinland map, which surfaced in the 20th century but was supposedly drawn in the 15th. It showed land west of Greenland, what we now know as North America. Scholars argue endlessly over whether it's authentic or a later forgery. Still, even without that, medieval Norse sagas spoke of Vinland, a lush coast across the sea. Historians still argue whether monks secretly recorded these tales on maps, preserving knowledge of the Americas long before Columbus. Imagine the hush in a candlelit scriptorium when a sailor's story crept across the desk. Beyond the sea, there's more land. Quirky tidbit: some maps included sea monsters not as decoration but as travel warnings, serpents curling along the Wabi. Aves weren't just fancy art, they marked real sailor encounters with whales, giant squids, or shoals. Picture a monk listening to a half-drunk sailor slur about a beast with eyes the size of shields, then sketching it faithfully on the parchment. The monster survives, while the sailor probably didn't. You trail your fingers across another map pinned to the wall. It shows Africa stretching southward with a vague outline of mountains and a river. Medieval myth insisted the Nile came from a mysterious fountain of paradise. But fact check, some monks copied surprisingly accurate details from Arab geographers who had explored further south. These maps blended myth and truth so seamlessly that it's hard to separate them even now. You almost chuckle. Google Maps would have been jealous if it had existed in 1300. The myths grew stranger when monks included islands that later explorers claimed to find. Take High Brazil, a phantom island west of Ireland. It appeared on maps for centuries, drawn as a perfect circle. Sailors swore they saw it rise from the fog, only to vanish again. Historians still argue whether it was a mirage, a missighted bit of real coast, or a complete invention, but the persistence of its cartographic cameo is undeniable. Whole expeditions launched to find a place that may never have existed. Quirky aside, monks often hid doodles in margins of maps: rabbits jousting, knights fighting snails, cats chasing mice. Imagine discovering a 700-year-old sketch of a knight losing to a snail and realizing the scribe was bored. Yet some of those doodles fed myths. Villagers who glimpsed them swore they were coded secrets, hints of creatures or lands the church didn't want revealed. Even doodles became portals to conspiracy. You move deeper into the chamber, where a huge table displays a world map stretching across animal hide parchment. Candlelight dances over its ink lines, and you see something uncanny, a continent-like smudge beyond the Atlantic. Is it real or just an ink blot? For a medieval mind, such blots were often interpreted as omens. Pilgrims swore some maps predicted lands across the ocean, and while scholars today scoff at psychic cartography, the coincidences are unsettling. Did whispers of distant voyages seep quietly into monastery walls? Historians still debate the case of the Piri Reis map, an Ottoman creation from the early 1500s but based on earlier sources. It seemed to depict parts of South America with uncanny precision. Did some of that knowledge trace back to European or even medieval monastic records? The jury is still out, but the myth persists that in candlelit cells, monks guarded secrets of lands no one should have known. The quirky reality: monks sometimes recycled old parchment, scraping away text to reuse the surface. Later generations discovered faint ghost maps underneath. Imagine uncovering a palimpsest with outlines of coasts that hadn't officially been charted yet. To a romantic imagination, it's proof of forbidden knowledge. To a scholar, it's just sloppy recycling. But try telling that to someone convinced the Vatican's basement still hides maps of Atlantis. You stand back, looking around at the silent desks, ink frozen in time. These monks weren't explorers, but they were collectors of whispers, sailors' yarns, pagan folklore, scraps of ancient science. In their hands the world expanded, and because maps were treated as half-sacred, every island, every coastline, every monster became a truth of sorts. Your torch burns lower, shadows thickening. Somewhere beyond this chamber, the fortress seems to groan. The sound reminds you of tunnels, of paths beneath the earth. And you realize where you're heading next, down into sewers, caves and dungeons where myths of underground monsters once crawled, creatures said to lurk just out of sight, born of darkness and fear. The fortress breathes as you descend, air damp and heavy with stone dust. Your torch sputters as the stairwell curls downward into darkness that smells of mildew and stagnant water. Beneath castles and cities stretched a hidden world of tunnels, drains and caverns, places that medieval people seldom saw, yet never stopped imagining. Here, myths of monsters were born, tales of underground beasts that crawled into stories, prayers and nightmares, Tonight you duck into that murky realm, following the echo of dripping water and distant growls that might be imagination, or not. The mainstream historical fact: medieval towns and castles had surprisingly extensive underground structures. Cisterns collected water, sewers carried waste, and storage vaults held grain, wine, or prisoners. In some cities, like Paris, labyrinthine networks sprawled beneath the streets, but because these places were dark, foul, and largely unseen, people filled the shadows with creatures. It wasn't enough to say rats live here. The human mind demanded drama. Thus, myths of serpents, crocodiles, and beasts lurking underfoot thrived. You pause at a dripping arch, tracing scratches etched into the wall. Quirky tidbit: in 14th century Paris there was a persistent rumor of a giant serpent living in the Seine's underground channels. Mothers warned children that the monster slithered into drains to snatch the careless. The reality? Probably eels or massive catfish thriving in foul water. But imagine looking into a dark sewer, hearing a splash and seeing eyes glimmer. You'd run screaming dragon before you even checked twice. Other myths crawled in from real intruders. In London, for example, people told tales of crocodiles lurking in drains. Laughable? Not entirely. Wealthy collectors sometimes kept exotic pets: monkeys, snakes, even crocodiles. When they grew inconvenient, they might have been dumped into rivers or wells. Archaeologists have indeed found crocodile bones in unexpected European contexts. Historians still argue whether these tales inspired the alligator in the sewer myth centuries before New York picked it up. You grin. Apparently, urban legends are the one export humans never stopped producing. The chamber you enter now is wide, with arched ceilings blackened by centuries of smoke. Imagine prisoners chained here, listening to skittering in the dark. Swearing beasts stalked the halls. Legends told of dungeon hounds, enormous dogs with glowing eyes. Reality check: wolves sometimes prowled near settlements and even slipped into towns. Once trapped underground, their howls echoed like demons. For peasants huddled above, the sound through floorboards became proof that hellhounds lived beneath their feet. The myths also fed on exaggerations of normal animals. Medieval bestiaries claimed monstrous rats lived below cities, large enough to drag infants away. Exaggeration, yes, but when plague years came, rats did play a horrific role. People believed the rodents themselves were supernatural, agents of curses. Quirky note: some chroniclers swore rats knew when plague was coming, vanishing days before outbreaks. Science today would call it migration behavior, but to medieval eyes it proved rats were demonic prophets. As your torchlight sweeps, you see a collapsed shaft leading deeper into the ground. Medieval folklore loved caves, mouths of the underworld. In Germany, miners swore kobolds, mischievous spirits, haunted tunnels. They explained sudden cave-ins, missing tools, or strange gases that choked men as the work of these creatures. Historians still debate whether kobold tales preserved faint memories of toxic minerals or whether they were simply excuses for accidents. Either way, the myth was real enough to shape behavior. Miners left offering jests of bread to appease them. The eerie echo of dripping water grows louder, and you imagine what peasants must have felt hearing similar noises beneath their homes. Myths said underground rivers were the veins of monsters, their blood rushing beneath earth. When floods burst through, villagers declared the beast had shifted in its sleep. You smirk at the thought: geology translated into bedtime horror stories. Quirky aside: in Norwich, legend spoke of a hell pit under the city where strange fumes escaped. In reality, it was marsh gas from decomposing vegetation. Light a torch too close, and flames leapt from the ground. To medieval minds, that wasn't chemistry. It was the breath of something alive. Picture stumbling home tipsy, striking a torch and watching the ground belch fire. You'd never sleep again. Historians still argue about one of the strangest myths: the green children of Woolpit, supposedly emerging from pits in Suffolk, England. Two children with green-tinted skin claim to have come from an underground land where everything glowed dimly. Whether it was folklore, malnutrition, or some lost tale of displaced foreigners, no one knows, yet the myth survived, tied to the same fear of underground worlds. You lean against the damp stone, listening. The air hums faintly, a vibration you almost mistake for growls. Maybe it's underground water, maybe shifting rock, but to a medieval ear that was monsters stretching. Even today, tourists in deep caves often report eerie sensations, a primal fear of unseen things. The myths simply gave those fears names. One final quirky note. Bones of cave bears, mammoths, and other prehistoric beasts were often found in caverns. To medieval eyes, these were not extinct animals. They were proof that monsters had once stalked or still did stalk the earth below. Imagine stumbling on a massive femur in the dark. You wouldn't think Ice Age fauna. You'd think dragon's dinner leftovers. You climb a narrow stair, torch sputtering low. Behind you, the dark hum continues like a sighing beast settling back into sleep. Ahead, brighter chambers wait, rooms of jeweled crowns and heavy gold where myths whispered of curses so strong that rulers themselves trembled to wear their treasures. The stairwell opens into a chamber unlike the dripping vaults you've just left. Here, the air feels heavy, not with dampness, but with the weight of glittering treasure. Gold catches the faint glow of your torch, jeweled crowns sit on faded cushions, and scepters gleam like snakes curled in sleep. You step slowly, almost afraid to breathe too loudly, because in the medieval imagination, treasures like these were not mere symbols of power. They were traps, cursed objects, whispering ruin into the ears of kings. Tonight, you place your hand gently on the cold edge of a crown and enter the world of the cursed regalia. The mainstream historical fact, royal crowns, swords, and relics of rulership often carried reputations of danger. Monarchs themselves whispered about bad luck attached to certain jewels or relics. One of the most famous examples is the Black Prince's ruby, which isn't even a ruby but a red spinel. It was said to bring disaster to whoever wore it, yet it still sits proudly in the British crown today, because who doesn't love tempting fate? You grin softly. Sometimes rulers are just gamblers with shinier dice. But curses were not always vague superstition. Quirky tidbit. Some jewels and metals really did make people sick. The green shimmer of certain crowns came from copper or arsenic-based pigments in the enamel. Wear that too long on sweaty skin and you'd feel weak, dizzy, poisoned. To the court, it looked like the curse was winning. To us, it's just science with a bad sense of humour. The myths of cursed crowns grew particularly thick in France. Chroniclers swore that every king who wore the crown of Charlemagne was doomed to misery. Evidence? Several monarchs indeed met grisly fates or oversaw disasters after coronation. Historians still argue whether it was coincidence, selective memory, or deliberate storytelling by rival factions. But when bad luck piles high enough, it's easy to believe a crown itself carries malice. You walk toward a pedestal where a tarnished circlet lies crooked. Imagine the coronation of a nervous young king, the crown lowered onto his head while priests chant. The myth says in that moment the crown tested the wearer. If he was unworthy, ruin followed. Was it political propaganda or genuine fear? Both, most likely. For peasants who suffered under a cruel ruler, the idea of a cursed crown was comforting, poetic justice at work. Quirky aside, the Hungarian crown of St. Stephen was said to tilt forward on the heads of illegitimate kings refusing to sit straight. In paintings it really does appear lopsided, but people read it as divine judgment. You imagine a king shifting uncomfortably while peasants snickered. Even the crown hates him. The myths weren't limited to crowns. Royal swords, too, carried reputations. The French sword joyeuse, linked to Charlemagne, was said to blind enemies with its brilliance. Any king who misused it would die mysteriously. When modern testing revealed the blade had been reforged from different centuries, the myth gained a new flavour. It wasn't one sword at all, but many stitched together, as if time itself conspired to make it eternal. You glance at a jewel-encrusted chalice nearby. Some coronation cups were said to carry curses if used improperly. One tale insists a Polish king drank from such a cup and dropped dead within the year. Historians still argue whether it was poison slipped in or whether the vessel really had dangerous mineral leaching. But to the terrified court, it was the curse fulfilled. The chamber seems to tighten around you, filled with the weight of stories. In Bohemia, the crown of Saint Wenceslas carried perhaps the most terrifying myth. Any usurper who wore it would die within a year. Legend claims Reinhard Heydrich, Nazi overlord of Prague, secretly placed the crown on his head during the occupation. Within a year, he was assassinated. Coincidence? Maybe. But the myth gained renewed life, proving even modern tyrants weren't immune to old whispers. Quirky note: jewels themselves often came with haunted backstories. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, though from later centuries, became notorious for bringing misfortune to men while blessing women. Medieval Europe had its own version, stones that supposedly carried the spirits of the dead. Some kings wore them anyway, gambling that their luck would be the exception. Spoiler: usually not. You move deeper, brushing your fingers across velvet faded to brown. Imagine the coronation ceremonies, incense rising, choirs booming, all eyes fixed on the crown. How could people not believe it had power? The moment was charged, trembling with meaning. If lightning struck outside, if the king faltered, if a candle blew out, instantly it was said the crown cursed him. Symbols this potent practically begged for myths. Historians still debate the psychological effect of these beliefs. Did kings fail because the crown was cursed, or because they feared it was? Self-fulfilling prophecy at its finest, a monarch stepping into the throne already convinced disaster waited might govern with paranoia, bringing about the very ruin he dreaded. You smirk softly. Crowns don't have to be cursed when human nerves do the job just fine. The torch flickers, as if in agreement, shadows bending like the bowed heads of courtiers. You feel the press of unseen eyes, as though the crowns themselves watch you. A bead of sweat slides down your temple, and for one irrational second you think, "Don't touch them." Then you laugh under your breath. You're not a king, so what's there to fear? Still, you step away, letting the treasures rest in silence. Ahead, the corridor opens into a workshop-like room, its tables cluttered with jars, alembics, and furnaces long cold. The myths waiting here smell of smoke and secrets, alchemists stirring bubbling cauldrons, chasing gold, stumbling into truths that science would later claim. The jeweled chamber recedes behind you, and the corridor grows warmer as you approach a different kind of myth. The air smells faintly of sulfur, like a kitchen where something burned long ago and never left. You step into a vaulted room cluttered with broken glassware, copper flasks, and scorched brick furnaces. This is where medieval alchemists once worked, chasing impossible dreams of turning lead into gold. Yet within their myths of magic and transmutation, strange truths glimmered, truths that quietly helped shape the beginnings of modern chemistry. The mainstream historical fact: alchemy in medieval Europe was a blend of mystical philosophy and practical experimentation. Practitioners believed metals were alive, maturing slowly in the earth, and that by coaxing them with heat and strange ingredients, you could perfect them into gold. It sounds absurd, yet their methods, distillation, sublimation, solution, were real processes that later chemists used to create medicines and acids. You pick up a cracked alembic flask, feel its smooth curve, and realize you're holding the ancestor of every lab beaker in the world. The myths, though, were irresistible. Alchemists swore they could create the philosopher's stone, a substance that granted immortality and endless wealth. Tales spread of men vanishing into their laboratories, emerging years later with a golden nugget or a vial of red elixir. Historians still argue whether any alchemist truly believed they had succeeded, or whether some were clever tricksters staging illusions to impress patrons. Either way, the myth thrived because it promised everything humans crave: life and riches. Quirky tidbit: some alchemists did stumble upon discoveries that seemed magical. In the 8th century, an alchemist in Baghdad described nitric acid for the first time. Later Europeans rediscovered it, calling it aqua fortis, the strong Ws. Ate that dissolved metals. Imagine dropping silver into liquid and watching it vanish. To villagers peeking in, that wasn't science, it was sorcery. You wander deeper into the workshop, past shelves holding jars of powders. Many of these were toxic: mercury, arsenic, antimony. Alchemists, unknowingly poisoning themselves, often died young, fueling myths that their experiments consumed them. You picture a weary man coughing black phlegm, his neighbors whispering, "The stone took him." In reality, it was mercury vapor slowly devouring his lungs. The myths sometimes even proved half true. Alchemists claimed certain mixtures could produce flashes of light or bursts of smoke. With sulfur and saltpeter in the mix, they accidentally invented gunpowder. Suddenly, the line between myth and miracle blurred. You hear an echoing boom in your imagination, some monk shrieking as his crucible explodes, neighbors convinced he'd summoned demons. In truth, he'd stumbled into the future of warfare. Historians still debate the role of secrecy in these myths. Alchemists often wrote in riddles and coded symbols, insisting they hid their recipes to protect the unworthy. Skeptics say this was just cover for the fact that most of their formulas didn't work. But their secrecy gave rise to the myth of forbidden knowledge, the idea that somewhere, hidden, the true stone existed. Even today, conspiracy theories whisper about manuscripts in Vatican vaults proving it was real. Quirky aside, some alchemists were surprisingly practical. Medieval recipes survive for distilling rosewater, creating colored glass, and even producing early forms of soap. Imagine a noblewoman sniffing a vial of rosewater and declaring it enchanted, while the alchemist muttered, "Actually, it's just petals and steam." Science wore a magical mask because myth sold better than reality. You pause by a furnace blackened with soot. A legend tells of an alchemist in Prague who fed his fire for 40 days without pause, claiming he would emerge with pure gold. On the final night, the furnace collapsed, leaving only slag. Neighbors swore they saw red light glowing under the rubble, the soul of the alchemist swallowed by his own creation. Whether embellishment or truth, it fed the myth that transmutation was dangerous to attempt, that the stone was jealous, and it consumed those who sought it. Another eerie story clings to your memory. Nicolas Flamel, a 14th century French scribe, was rumored to have discovered the philosopher's stone. Chronicles centuries later insisted he and his wife achieved immortality, vanishing mysteriously. Historians point out Flamel was just a wealthy man whose legend snowballed, but even now tourists leave notes at his supposed grave in Paris. The myth remains alive, glowing faintly like embers in ash. You glance at a scroll half buried under rubble. On it, symbols twist into dragons eating their own tails, suns merging with moons. Alchemical texts weren't just recipes, they were allegories. To the alchemist, turning lead into gold was also about turning the imperfect soul into something pure. This philosophical layer meant myths flourished even when experiments failed. If the crucible yielded nothing, the alchemist could shrug. "Ah, but my spirit is transformed." Clever loophole, really. Historians still argue whether alchemists genuinely contributed to science or whether their work was a centuries-long distraction, yet undeniable progress dripped from their cauldrons. Distilled alcohol for medicine, acids for etching, pigments for art, all gifts wrapped in the cloak of myth. The boundary between superstition and science blurred here in the smoky heat of stone furnaces. Your torch sputters lower as you stand in the center of the ruined lab. The myths of alchemy weren't just about greed, they were about hope, the dream that nature's secrets could be bent to human will. And while no philosopher's stone ever materialized, the echoes of their experiments built the scaffolding for chemistry itself. You step carefully out of the workshop, ears still ringing with imagined explosions. The corridor beyond opens into quieter halls, draped with faded tapestries. Ahead lies a different kind of myth, not about fire and gold, but about forgotten power. Queens and women erased from chronicles, yet stubbornly returning in stories and half-buried truths. You leave behind the scorched scent of furnaces and step into a corridor lined with faded tapestries. The air here feels softer, tinged with dust and fabric rather than smoke and metal. Dim embroidery depicts crowned figures, but the faces are blurred by time, threads unraveled until only outlines remain. You pause, tracing the stitched silhouettes, and realize something. Many of the missing faces once belonged to women. Tonight you walk into the myths of hidden queens and forgotten women of power, figures erased from chronicles yet stubbornly alive in story and fragment. The mainstream historical fact is undeniable. Women in medieval Europe wielded influence far greater than most textbooks admit. Queens acted as regents, nuns controlled vast landholdings, and noble women arranged alliances that shaped entire kingdoms. Yet chroniclers, usually monks, often downplayed or erased their roles, preferring to spin myths that cast women as temptresses, witches, or passive consorts. In that void, legends grew of queens who ruled secretly or whose power was so great it had to be hidden under the mask of myth. You stop before a tapestry showing a crowned woman holding a sword. Her face is gone, the threads unravelled, but the story might be that of Queen Matilda of England, who nearly seized the throne in the 12th century. Chroniclers wrote her as proud, arrogant, unfeminine, myths designed to excuse her downfall, yet real records reveal she was intelligent and commanding. The myth of the unruly empress hid the fact that she came dangerously close to reshaping England's monarchy. Historians still argue whether her reputation was sabotage or deserved, but the myth lingers louder than the truth. Quirky tidbit. In some chronicles, women who acted decisively were described as manly. Not an insult, at least not always, but a mythic rebranding, as though female power could only be explained by borrowing male traits. Imagine a queen leading armies and a monk scratching his head. Clearly she grew a man's spirit overnight. Convenient myth, don't you think? You move into a smaller chamber where statues line the walls. One depicts Eleanor of Aquitaine, carved sternly in stone. The myths around her were endless: seductress, poisoner, even secret plotter of crusades. The truth? She controlled more land than the King of France and maneuvered through 2 powerful marriages, but because that power unsettled male chroniclers, she was cast as a dangerous myth, a femme fatale, centuries before noir. You lean close to her statue and imagine her smirking, if the shoe fits. Further along, another figure stares from the shadows, Joan of Arc. Here, myth and truth fuse so tightly they're almost inseparable. A peasant girl who led armies, guided by visions of saints. The mainstream fact is clear: she inspired troops and shifted the 100 Years' War, but myths exploded. Some swore she had magical armor, others that her sword appeared miraculously in a church wall. Historians still argue whether her voices were genuine spiritual experiences, psychological episodes, or political manipulation. What's certain is that myths shaped her trial as much as facts did. Quirky aside, one myth claims Joan never died at the stake, that a double was burned while she lived in hiding. This persistent rumor shows how unwilling people were to let such a powerful woman truly vanish. A reminder that sometimes myths exist because reality feels too unbearable. You brush your hand along a cracked reliquary in the corner. Legends tell of queens who cursed enemies with jewelry, rings said to bring death if worn. In truth, medieval women often used gems as political symbols: ruby for authority, sapphire for loyalty. Over time, the symbolism warped into myths of sorcery. Imagine a noble woman sliding a ring across the table, smiling sweetly. To her rival, it wasn't just jewelry, it was doom wrapped in silver. Another forgotten figure drifts into memory. Queen Jadwiga of Poland, crowned not as consort but as king in her own right in 1384. Chronicles insisted she was holy, almost saint-like, but whispers said she could outwit entire councils. The myth of her saintliness smoothed over the fact that she negotiated politics with a sharpness that unnerved her male peers. Later canonized, she became more myth than woman, yet her policies left permanent marks on Europe. Historians still debate Christine de Pizan, often called Europe's first female professional writer. Myths swirled that she was divinely inspired, a vessel for wisdom no woman should naturally have. In reality, she was simply educated, sharp, and determined to defend women's reputations against slander. But because her voice was so rare, it felt mythical even to contemporaries. Imagine her dipping her quill while men muttered, "Surely she's possessed." You laugh softly, possession by intelligence perhaps. You step through another archway and find murals of nameless women, midwives, abbesses, merchants. Each carries a myth. Midwives were accused of stealing babies for witches' covens. Abbesses were rumoured to secretly direct kings. Female merchants who prospered were said to use charms. All of these myths explain something simple. Medieval society struggled to accept women's visible power. When reality was uncomfortable, myth stepped in to smooth it over, sometimes flattering. More often demonizing. Quirky note, some myths were positive. In Wales, stories told of queens who healed the land simply by walking its borders, crops springing behind them. Though symbolic, it reflected the truth that noble women did manage estates, overseeing fields and workers. Reality dressed in the robes of legend. You pause, letting silence swell. These forgotten women were never truly forgotten. They just returned through myth, waiting in margins, carvings, rumours, and you, standing here centuries later, can almost hear them sigh. We were always here. The corridor narrows again, pulling you onward. Ahead lies a darker myth still, omens of plague, whispers that disease announced itself with strange signs in sky and soil. You step toward the stench of sickness and the terror of pestilence. The air grows heavy as you move forward, the sweet scent of faded tapestries giving way to something sour, metallic, almost like old medicine bottles left too long uncorked. You cover your mouth instinctively, though the plague is centuries gone, its shadow still clinging to these stones. Tonight you step into the world of pestilence myths, dark omens that people swore foretold disease, strange signs in the heavens, in the bodies of animals, even in the whispers of the wind. These myths blurred the line between superstition and survival, and sometimes uncomfortably they carried threads of truth. The mainstream historical fact, the Black Death of the 14th century killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. Entire villages were erased, cities emptied, families vanished overnight. With little understanding of germs or contagion, medieval people explained what they saw through omens. A sudden red sunrise meant plague was near. A flock of ravens circling a field predicted death. Even comets were feared as plague bearers. You picture a terrified villager staring at the sky, reading doom in every streak of light. Quirky tidbit, some chroniclers swore that plague was preceded by strange smells, sulphur, rotting fruit, or the stench of dragons. It sounds fanciful, but there's a kernel of sense. Plague often followed famine, floods, or earthquakes, when decomposition left a literal stink across the land. The dragon's breath myth was simply noses noticing environmental decay before human minds could frame it scientifically. You step into a chamber painted with crude murals, skeletal horsemen galloping, stars blazing overhead. The myths of plague stars fascinated medieval Europe. When Halley's comet passed in 1347, people said its fiery tail poured poison into the air, setting the stage for pestilence. Historians still argue whether comets merely coincided with outbreak, or whether dust and climate shifts played small roles in spreading illness. Either way, to frightened villagers, the sky itself looked diseased. The torchlight wavers, and you notice a niche filled with dried herbs. People once hung bundles of lavender, rosemary, and wormwood above doors, convinced they repelled plague spirits. Here's the eerie twist. Some of those herbs actually contain mild antibacterial or insect-repelling properties. Not enough to stop Yersinia pestis, but enough to slow fleas. A myth with a hint of accidental science. You smile grimly. Sometimes desperation produces solutions that aren't entirely wrong. Historians still debate the infamous plague doctors with their bird-like masks stuffed with herbs. Were they quacks or pioneers? To contemporaries, they looked like demons walking the streets, myths incarnate. Some said they were omens themselves. If you saw the Birdman, death would follow. In reality, their masks gave minor protection against foul air, but the mythic terror they inspired was just as powerful as any cure. Imagine opening your shutters to see a silent masked figure striding below. You'd probably slam them shut and start praying immediately. Quirky aside, villagers believed animals sensed plague before humans. Dogs howling, cats vanishing, cows refusing to graze. These were read as signs. Modern science shows animals do react to environmental shifts, even plagues carried by fleas. But to medieval minds, the animals weren't reacting, they were warning. The myth of the howling dog of death became so persistent that even Shakespeare referenced it centuries later. You pass a cracked stone basin in the corner. People once filled these with vinegar, dipping coins before trading, hoping to wash away contagion. The myth was that vinegar burned demons of disease. Yet vinegar is mildly antiseptic and in some cases may have slowed transmission. Another eerie half-truth, science disguised as superstition. The myths could turn darker. Some said plague arrived when mysterious strangers spread powders or oils, rumors that often targeted outsiders or minorities, leading to horrific persecutions. Historians still argue whether these accusations were purely scapegoating or whether people genuinely believed they saw plague spreaders. Either way, myths weaponized fear, transforming neighbors into enemies. You shake your head in the dim chamber. Terror doesn't need facts, it only needs stories. Quirky note, celestial blood rains were also thought to predict plague. Red-tinged rain fell in parts of Europe, staining clothes and crops. People swore it was divine wrath. Today we know red dust blown from Africa's deserts can tint rainfall, but imagine red droplets splattering your linen tunic. You'd probably assume the heavens were bleeding. You pause by a mural of skeletons dancing, the famous Danse Macabre. Myth said the dead rose to remind the living of their fate. The truth? It was art and performance meant to cope with mortality. Yet villagers swore they saw ghostly processions during plague years, skeletons marching in silence. Maybe hallucinations, maybe shadows in torchlight. But the myth kept fear alive long after the fever ended. Historians still debate the so-called plague pits. Mass graves were real, but myths claimed the earth itself trembled when they were dug, or that blue flames flickered above them at night. Science offers marsh gas again, rising from decomposing bodies, but to the grieving it was souls escaping, glowing. In protest, stand near one of those pits at dusk and you'd believe it too. You exhale slowly, the chamber thick with invisible memories of coughs and prayers. The myths of plague omens reveal a truth. People craved signs, any signs, to make sense of chaos. Sometimes those signs were rooted in real phenomena, animals fleeing, bad smells, unusual weather. Other times they were pure projection, but all of them wove together into a tapestry of dread that still clings centuries later. Your torch sputters, and for a moment the smoke coils upward like a black comet tail. You smile grimly. The myths are not done. Ahead, whispers tell of giants, hulking figures whose bones lay buried under farmland, convincing generations that titans once walked among them. You leave the plague murals behind, stepping into a corridor where the ceiling rises higher, the air cooler, as though the fortress itself expands to make room for larger shapes. Here the myths are heavier, looming, giants said to have once walked the earth. Medieval villagers swore they tilled the fields beside their cottages, left their footprints in valleys, and even built the crumbling stone walls that no one could explain. Tonight you trace those colossal shadows, following myths that stretched tall and broad, yet often grew from bones buried quietly in the soil. The mainstream historical fact: medieval Europe frequently unearthed large bones. Farmers ploughing fields turned up femurs longer than their arms, skulls bigger than pumpkins. Without knowledge of extinct animals, people assumed the bones belonged to giants. Some even displayed them in churches as proof of biblical stories. In Antwerp Cathedral for centuries, massive bones were shown as belonging to a slain giant named Druon Antigone. Modern science later identified them as whale bones, but by then the myth was already cemented in civic pride. Quirky tidbit: bones of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, unearthed in Germany and France, were mistaken for giant humans. Local monks insisted these were the remains of ancient warriors wiped out by divine wrath. Some bones were even chained in town halls like trophies of God's justice. Imagine standing in a village square while a priest points to an enormous femur hanging from the rafters. Behold the ungodly who grew too tall. You'd nod vigorously and maybe sleep with one eye open. The myths took on heroic tones too. In Britain, tales of Gog-Magog, a giant defeated by Brutus the Trojan, explained why enormous stone circles like Stonehenge seemed impossible for ordinary men to build. The truth? Engineering genius and thousands of labourers, but to medieval NDS, only giants could have moved stones weighing tons. Historians still argue whether these myths preserved garbled folk memory of prehistoric monuments or simply filled the void of explanation. Either way, the myth gave the stones life. You walk into a tall chamber where carvings on the walls depict men wrestling beasts. Some show figures towering twice the height of mortals. These were not just monsters, they were ancestors in myth. Entire dynasties claimed descent from giants, a way of legitimizing their strength. In Ireland, stories of Fionn mac Cumhail explained not only great deeds, but also natural landmarks like the Giant's Causeway, those massive hexagonal stones, proof of footsteps, villagers said. Even now, tourists feel the myth tugging as they stand among them. Quirky aside, skeletons with deformities sometimes fueled giant tales. Conditions like gigantism or acromegaly left real people unusually tall or with enlarged bones. Imagine burying a man over 7 feet tall in a medieval hamlet, then later unearthing him. To his descendants, he became a local legend, giant blood in the family. The myth practically wrote itself. You pause at a stone bench, listening to the echo of dripping water. Myths claimed giants left springs wherever they stepped, their footprints filling with water to become ponds. In truth, sinkholes and natural basins dotted the landscape, but it's easy to imagine a villager pointing at a perfectly round pond and saying, "That's where the giant paused to drink." Historians still debate the role giants played in religion. Were they cautionary tales showing the dangers of pride, or were they lingering memories of pagan deities rebranded as villains? The Old Testament's Nephilim, the giant offspring of angels and humans, mingled with European folklore, giving medieval Christians a framework to explain every oversized bone. The blurred line between scripture and superstition made giants feel both terrifying and holy at once. Quirky note: in Switzerland, villagers kept what they thought was a giant's tooth. Centuries later, scientists examined it. Turned out to be a fossilized mammoth molar. But imagine seeing a tooth the size of your fist. Would you calmly say prehistoric herbivore? Or would you sprint to church shouting, "The giant is real"? Exactly. You step into a gallery where massive ribs are chained along the wall. These were displayed in medieval times as proof that giants had fought here. In reality, they were whale ribs washed ashore and carried inland. Yet the myths shaped memory so powerfully that when townspeople prayed in that space, they imagined colossal beings groaning beneath the earth, waiting to rise again. One particularly chilling myth told of sleeping giants under hills. When thunder rolled, villagers said it was the giants turning in their slumber. Some legends promised that at the end of days the giants would wake, striding across the land to trample cities. Historians still argue whether these tales echoed pagan apocalypse myths or grew from the unsettling habit of earthquakes rumbling beneath villages. Either way, to a medieval farmer, thunder was never just weather, it was footsteps. You let your hand brush over a carving of a giant holding a sword. The inscription warns of hubris, that those who grow too large, in body or pride, will fall. Myths of giants weren't just curiosities, they were lessons. Pride makes men monstrous, greed makes them too heavy to stand. In this way, the myth of the giant mirrored the myth of the tyrant king, a reflection of power distorted until it toppled. The torch sputters, and shadows loom taller, stretching into exaggerated shapes. For a moment, the walls themselves seem to grow. You imagine the ceiling lifting, the floor shaking, as if something beneath you stirs awake. You exhale, shaking off the thought, but the myth linger. Giants may be gone, but their bones still haunt the soil. The corridor ahead gleams faintly. metal catching the light. Weapons wait there, whispered about in myth. Swords said to sing, blades said to glow, steel that seemed alive in a warrior's hand. You tighten your grip on the torch and step forward into the armory of legend. The stone floor narrows into a passage where the echoes of your boots grow sharper, more metallic, until you enter a long chamber lined with racks of rusted weapons. Blades lean against the walls like tired soldiers, spears sag with splintered shafts, and broken hilts lie scattered across the floor like discarded bones. Here, myths whispered of swords that sang, weapons that glowed, and blades that carried souls. Tonight, you stand in the armory of legend, where steel seemed to hum with more than just sharpness. The mainstream historical fact: medieval Europe produced extraordinary swords through techniques so advanced they seemed magical. Pattern-welded blades shimmered with wave-like patterns in the steel, giving the illusion of movement. Damascus steel, imported from the East, was famed for its resilience and sharpness. When knights drew such blades under torchlight, the patterns gleamed like rippling water. To the common eye, this was proof the weapon was alive. You lift a corroded sword from the rack and imagine how its polished surface once shimmered, inspiring myths of singing swords. Quirky tidbit: some swords really did sing. When struck or swung quickly, the vibration of steel produced a faint hum, audible in quiet spaces. Imagine a warrior raising his sword at dawn, the blade buzzing faintly in the silence. To superstitious soldiers, it wasn't resonance, it was the sword's voice. Some even claimed their weapons cried for blood if battle was near. A blacksmith would explain physics, a peasant would mutter prayers. The myths reached heights of grandeur. The sword Excalibur, pulled from stone or gifted by a lake spirit, symbolized divine kingship. While Arthurian legend belongs more to myth than history, real rulers craved swords of legend to validate their power. The sword of St. Peter in Poland, for example, was paraded as a relic, its supposed apost, Olic origin granting divine legitimacy. Historians still argue whether the sword was truly ancient or forged centuries later to anchor the myth. Either way, believers bowed as though it held heaven in its hilt. You step deeper, torchlight reflecting off rusted edges. Myths insisted that certain swords glowed in the dark. Sound absurd, not entirely. Blades polished with phosphorus-rich materials or smeared with bioluminescent lichen may have glimmered faintly. Imagine a knight unsheathing his weapon at midnight, the edge shimmering green. To terrified enemies, that wasn't chemistry, it was sorcery. Another story rises here. The Norse sword Tyrfing, cursed to kill whenever drawn. Every time it was used, it demanded blood. Medieval chroniclers loved cursed weapons because they mirrored the truth of war. Violence always takes more than intended. But curses also stemmed from real accidents. Swords could snap in combat, their shards injuring wielders as often as enemies. What better explanation than a curse? Quirky aside, one medieval sword unearthed in Poland bore an inscription reading, "In nomine Domini," in the name of the Lord. Some believed the lettering made the blade invincible. Tests show the steel was of superior quality, but no different than others, yet myths grow easily from scratches on steel. Imagine a soldier reading holy words on his blade and feeling invincible. That confidence alone might have made him fight like a man possessed. Historians still debate the Ulfbert swords discovered across Europe. These blades, marked with inscriptions, were made of steel so pure it resembled modern crucible steel. In an age when most iron was brittle, Ulfberts cut through armor with terrifying ease. Villagers swore they were forged by giants or gifted by the gods. Modern metallurgists shake their heads, still puzzled how such technology appeared centuries before its time. To a peasant watching sparks fly from an Ulfbert's edge, it wasn't metallurgy, it was magic. You stop before a rack of ceremonial weapons, gilded and impractical. Some myths claim such swords wept blood before disasters. In reality, rust bleeding through polish could leave red streaks, but to medieval minds the sword was mourning, warning its owner of doom. You imagine a king lifting his blade to find crimson tears running down. Would you call a smith or an exorcist? Quirky note: Swords were also believed to hold souls. Some knights swore their spirits would live forever inside their weapons. Families passed down heirloom blades as if they carried the ancestors' voice. When those blades sang or hummed, descendants whispered it was their forefather speaking. The myth gave steel more weight than any jewel. You lift a chipped blade and swing it slowly. The faint vibration hums against your palm, eerie in the silence. For a moment you wonder, how much of the myth is imagination, and how much is simply the sword doing what steel does? The answer hardly matters. Belief is what made the weapon legendary. Historians still argue whether these myths strengthened morale or simply reflected fear. Did men fight harder because they believed their swords were enchanted? Likely yes. Did rulers encourage such myths to bind loyalty? Absolutely. A sword that glowed or sang wasn't just a weapon, it was propaganda, carried in steel. You rest the blade big, back in its rack, torchlight quivering on its edge. The myths of swords remind you that tools often carry more than their function. They become symbols, alive in imagination, and as your torch dims, shadows stretch into shapes of banners and beasts, griffins, unicorns, lions, creatures painted on shields and stitched onto flags. The myths of beasts in heraldry are calling, waiting just beyond this hall. The armory fades behind you, its rusting blades humming faintly in your imagination, and you step into a gallery where stone banners still hang from the walls. Painted shields and torn standards cling to the air like echoes of tournaments long past. Here, the myths are stitched and painted, beasts marching across cloth and wood. Unicorns, griffins, lions, dragons, symbols of families and kingdoms. To a medieval mind, heraldry wasn't just decoration, it was a language of power, where every beast carried myth, magic, and sometimes curious fragments of reality. The mainstream historical fact: heraldry emerged in the 12th century as a way to identify knights in battle, since their faces were hidden behind helmets. Designs were bold, simple, and often drawn from animals. Lions meant courage, eagles signaled dominance, stags symbolized purity. Yet alongside real beasts, heraldry burst with mythological creatures, unicorns, griffins, wyverns. To soldiers on muddy fields, these weren't just pictures, they were battle companions, guardians drawn into being by paint and belief. Quirky tidbit: unicorns in heraldry weren't simply fantasy. Medieval bestiaries described unicorns as real animals, small white horses with single horns, tamed only by maidens. The myth likely came from travelers' descriptions of the oryx or narwhal tusks traded as curiosities. Kings who placed unicorns on their banners weren't declaring fairy tale fandom, they were staking claims to purity and divine favour. Even today, Scotland clings proudly to the unicorn as a national symbol. You grin: if you're going to choose a mascot, might as well pick the most stylish imaginary horse. You stop before a faded shield painted with a griffin, eagle's head and wings, lion's body. The myth said griffins guarded treasure in mountains, fierce enough to tear men apart. Historians still argue whether the myth arose from fossilized dinosaur bones found in Central Asia, mistaken for beaked monsters. Traders brought stories westward, and soon the griffin perched proudly on European banners. The beast may have been imaginary, but the bones were real. The corridor widens, and you see another crest, a double-headed eagle, wings spread wide. This wasn't myth, it was symbol, but myth gave it teeth. Chroniclers said the eagle saw both heaven and earth, past and future. To peasants, a king with such a symbol wasn't just ruling land, he was ruling destiny. A bird of prey painted on a flag somehow turned into prophecy. Quirky aside, heraldry could get comically odd. Some knights bore snails on their shields. Yes, snails. Marginal art in manuscripts often mocked knights as being chased or defeated by oversized snails. Historians still debate why. Satire, symbol of humility, or just monks doodling. Whatever the origin, villagers saw those symbols and spun myths about armored snails slowly advancing in vengeance. You chuckle, fear the unstoppable snail of doom. The myths of heraldic beasts shaped behavior too. A knight under a lion banner was expected to fight with ferocity. One beneath a swan crest had to embody grace. To break those expectations risked shame. Myth turned into social contract, forcing men to live up to painted fantasies. You pause before a banner sagging with age, showing a wyvern, two-legged dragon, tail curled like a whip. Myth said its venom could scorch fields, but reality? Tales likely came from encounters with large snakes, exaggerated through retelling. Yet when that beast was painted on a shield, enemies flinched. Myth as psychological weapon. Historians still debate how literal people took heraldic beasts. Did peasants really think unicorns or griffins existed? Evidence suggests yes, many believed travelers' tales and bestiaries were treated as factual. A soldier who sees ideas, or a griffin crest might whisper, their lord commands monsters. In that sense, heraldry blurred imagination and reality deliberately. Quirky note: narwhal tusks sold in Europe were often displayed as unicorn horns in treasuries. Some ended up mounted on banners or staves carried into battle. Imagine the confidence boost of waving a so-called unicorn horn while charging into cavalry. Even if the horn was just a whale's tooth, the myth turned it into a divine spear. You step deeper, torchlight flickering over walls painted with rampant lions. The lion is the most common heraldic beast, symbol of courage. Yet England's lions weren't native. They had to rely on stories from travellers or on faint memories of Roman amphitheatres. Still, people believed their kings bore the strength of real lions. The myth was convincing enough that no one cared whether the nearest lion was hundreds of miles away. Some beasts in heraldry were symbolic jokes too. The heraldic Yale, a goat-like creature with swivelling horns, appeared on royal arms. Chronicles described it earnestly as though it grazed in real fields. It probably grew from garbled reports of antelopes. Still, to the medieval mind, every horned beast seemed plausible. The world was big, mysterious, and the sea hid more than it revealed. You let the torch dip, shadows twisting griffins and unicorns into motion. For a moment, it feels as if they stir, ready to leap from stone. That's the power heraldry carried, symbols treated as beings capable of protecting, cursing, or inspiring. On the battlefield, the banner wasn't cloth, it was a talisman. Historians still argue whether heraldry was propaganda, art, or religion. Likely it was all three. To modern eyes, a unicorn is fantasy. To medieval eyes, it was a holy beast galloping invisibly beside them. Belief made it real. The gallery ends in a vaulted doorway where shelves of books lean precariously. Ahead lies the realm of lost libraries, tales of vanished manuscripts, secret texts, and myths that some knowledge was deliberately hidden until the right time. You step carefully, ready to wander into the myths of forgotten words. You pass under the vaulted doorway, stepping into a chamber lined with shelves that sag under the weight of forgotten manuscripts. Dust cloaks everything here, and when you brush your hand along a spine, flakes drift down like old snow. The smell is rich, parchment, leather, ink turned sour with time. This is the world of lost libraries where myths insist that knowledge was deliberately hidden, destroyed, or spirited away, waiting to be rediscovered centuries later. The mainstream historical fact: medieval Europe saw countless libraries vanish in fire, war, and neglect. Monasteries housed some of the greatest collections of texts, works of Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, yet raiders burned them or reformers tossed them out as heresy. Still, myths bloomed that the knowledge wasn't destroyed at all but carried away, buried in secret vaults. The most famous example remains the Library of Alexandria. Though that predates the Middle Ages, medieval scholars whispered that fragments survived, hidden in Islamic libraries or beneath Vatican stone. Quirky tidbit: sometimes lost books weren't lost at all, they were simply misplaced in vast archives. In 1417, an Italian humanist stumbled across a dusty copy of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things in a German monastery. For centuries it had been sitting there, misfiled and ignored, treated as just another volume. Villagers spun myths that rediscovered books were gifts of saints, rising from the dead to help mankind. In reality, it was poor medieval inventory management. You pause by a shelf where blank spaces gape like missing teeth. Legends said monasteries deliberately left gaps, hiding dangerous books from the unworthy. Did monks actually conceal works of pagan magic or forbidden philosophy? Historians still argue. Some records show lists of books sealed in locked chests, awaiting divine guidance to be reopened. Imagine sitting idle in a scriptorium, sliding a volume into a box and whispering, "Not yet." To the next generation, that act looked like deliberate conspiracy. The myths grow stranger. Tales spread of libraries that moved on their own, entire collections vanishing from one monastery, reappearing in another. Likely explanation, looting during raids followed by creative retelling. But to medieval minds it proved that knowledge itself chose where it wanted to live. A book was never just parchment, it was alive, and it might walk away if neglected. Quirky aside, monks sometimes wrote curses into books, threats to anyone who stole them. Margins warned that thieves would be excommunicated or strangled by demons. When volumes vanished anyway, villagers assumed the curses had worked. Imagine finding your neighbor dead of natural causes and realizing he'd borrowed a manuscript last week. You'd swear the demon did it. The torchlight brushes over a collapsed shelf where pages spill like dried leaves. Some myths insist that secret books held prophecies, predictions of plagues, wars, and kings unborn. Nostradamus gets all the fame, but medieval monks too claimed to write volumes of visions. When those vanished, people insisted they were locked away to prevent panic. Historians still debate whether certain prophecies were genuine records or later forgeries slipped into circulation. Either way, the myth of the hidden prophetic book remains. You kneel beside a chest half buried under rubble. Its lock is twisted, the lid broken, but inside are scraps of parchment with diagrams, circles, suns, strange letters. Such fragments fed myths of grimoires, magical libraries where monks studied alchemy, astrology, or necromancy in secret. In truth, many monasteries did keep astrological texts, not as sorcery but as science. Yet when peasants glimpsed monks drawing stars on parchment, the myth of forbidden grimoires flared alive. Historians still argue about the fabled Book of Thoth, rumoured to grant mastery over nature, or the equally mysterious Voynich manuscript, a book written in undecipherable script filled with odd plants and naked figures. Some believe it was medieval nonsense, others think it hides coded medical recipes. Its myth has lasted because no one can yet prove otherwise. Quirky note, not all lost libraries were vast. Sometimes a single chest of books vanished and became legend. In Iceland, sagas tell of manuscripts containing ancient spells stolen by rival chieftains, hidden in caves. Modern archaeologists find scraps of vellum in those caves, water-damaged but real, enough truth to keep the myth burning. You step deeper, noticing painted stars across the ceiling. In some traditions, entire libraries were linked to astrology, designed so their shelves matched constellations. When these libraries fell, myths said the heavens themselves mourned, stars blinking out as books burned. Science says it was just weather. But imagine standing under the night sky during a raid, flames leaping, clouds rolling over stars. You'd swear the cosmos was grieving too. The silence here feels heavier than any battlefield. Books hold memory differently. When they vanish, it feels like people themselves vanish with them. That's why myths of lost libraries sting. They're humanity's fear of forgetting dressed up in story. Even today, conspiracy whispers insist secret archives exist beneath the Vatican or hidden under mountains, holding truths we're not ready for. The medieval mind believed the same. You brush dust from your sleeves, stepping out of the room as the last shelves lean tiredly into shadow. Ahead lies a narrower corridor, and from it you hear faint murmurs, almost rhythmic like chanting. These are the myths of prophecy, seers whose words echoed through time, predictions that sometimes lined up so eerily with reality that even now historians hesitate. The corridor narrows into a vaulted chamber where the walls are painted with faded constellations. The air hums faintly as though whispers linger here, caught in the stone. You hold your torch higher and the flicker dances across carved figures, bearded prophets, hooded monks, women with blank eyes. Tonight you walk among the myths of prophecy, stories of seers whose words seemed nonsense until the world bent to prove them true. The mainstream historical fact. Prophecy was taken seriously in medieval Europe. Monarchs kept astrologers, bishops consulted visionaries, and peasants spread stories of local seers predicting famines, floods, or wars. Whether through stars, dreams, or sheer intuition, people believed the future could be glimpsed. Sometimes eerie coincidences gave these myths teeth. When Halley's comet appeared in 1066, many swore it foretold doom for England. Months later, William the Conqueror invaded at Hastings. To terrified villagers, the connection was undeniable. Quirky tidbit: prophecy often came through riddles. The Welsh seer Myrddin, who later morphed into the mythic Merlin, allegedly muttered visions of red blood on white snow, vague enough to fit countless battles but convincing when one finally did. Medieval minds adored ambiguity because it let any event feel foretold. You chuckle. Prophets were basically the medieval version of horoscope writers, keeping things just vague enough to always be right. The myths also birthed infamous names. Take Mother Shipton, England's legendary witch prophet. Stories claim she foresaw the Great Fire of London, even cars and airplanes centuries before their time. Historians still argue whether these verses were genuinely hers or invented later to boost her fame. Either way, the myth of the wrinkled crone with uncanny sight outlived the woman herself. You move past a pedestal with broken parchment, it's in smeared into illegibility. Myths insist that hidden books of prophecy contained secrets of the end of days. The Sibylline oracles, passed down from antiquity, resurfaced in medieval Europe, fueling belief that every disaster was scripted. When plague struck, when war burned, people turned to prophecy like addicts, desperate for patterns. Quirky aside, sometimes prophecy was political theatre. Kings and popes staged predictions to justify wars. A priest might dream of victory the night before battle, conveniently boosting morale. Later chroniclers would record it as if saints whispered in his sleep. For soldiers already terrified, the myth carried weight. Better to march into blood, convinced heaven had already signed the outcome. Historians still debate the role of astrology in medieval prophecy. Was it superstition or science? Learned men like Johannes de Sacrobosco mapped stars with precision, believing planetary conjunctions foretold floods or plagues. When Saturn and Jupiter aligned in 1345, astrologers warned of pestilence. Months later, the Black Death erupted. Coincidence? Or the stars aligning with grim precision? Even now, scholars hesitate to dismiss the eerie timing. You stop before a carving of a blindfolded woman holding scales. The myth of Cassandra-like figures, those who saw truth but were ignored, haunted medieval imagination. Many towns told stories of local prophets ridiculed in life, vindicated in death. Imagine the bitter satisfaction of a villager muttering, "They laughed when she warned us, but look now, the river has swallowed the bridge." Quirky note: prophetic animals weren't left out. Cocks that crowed at midnight, oxen that refused to plough, or dogs that barked endlessly at empty air, all became omens in chronicles. When events followed, villagers called it prophecy. Today we'd say weird animal behavior. Back then it was divine warning delivered by fur and feathers. You stand still, letting silence seep in. The myths of prophecy weren't just about predicting doom, they were about comfort. If disasters could be foretold, then perhaps they had meaning. Chaos wasn't random, it was scripted. Even if the script was terrifying, it reassured people that someone, somewhere, had the plot. Historians still argue about one famous case, Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess who wrote visions of fiery mountains, floods, and corruption in the church. Were her visions medical hallucinations from migraines or genuine mystical experiences? Either way, her words echoed so powerfully that even popes listened. A woman's voice in a man's world became mythic simply by being heard. The torch dips, shadows stretching the carved prophets until they seem to lean forward, mouths open. You imagine whispers, "Beware the east wind, beware the red moon, beware the silence after birds fall quiet." Your skin prickles. You laugh softly at yourself. Every age makes its own prophecies, and every age swears they're true. As you leave the chamber, the air feels heavier, soil-scented, as if the ground itself is swelling. The myths ahead speak not of visions in sky or star, but of cities buried under fields, towns thought to be legend until spades struck stone. The air thickens with the smell of soil and stone as you descend into another vast chamber. The floor here seems uneven, as though you're walking across buried roofs and cobblestones. Your torchlight reveals walls of packed earth, half-digested foundations peeking through like bones under thin skin. You realize you've stepped into the myths of buried cities, places peasants swore had once stood proud, only to sink into the ground, vanish beneath fields, or slip into rivers. For centuries, people thought these towns were nothing more than cautionary tales, but the spade and trowel of archaeology proved otherwise. The mainstream historical fact: throughout Europe, entire medieval towns and Roman settlements were abandoned and forgotten, later rediscovered beneath farmland. At Silchester in England, once a bustling Roman town, farmers ploughed fields for centuries. Swearing bells could still be heard ringing below on quiet nights. Excavations in the 19th century revealed streets, mosaics, wells, all the bones of a city long thought mythical. You kneel now, brushing imaginary dirt from the outline of a tiled floor, picturing villagers centuries earlier whispering, "There are ghosts beneath our crops." Quirky tidbit: peasants often told stories of church towers that sank into the earth as punishment for sin. In Germany, locals swore they heard organ music rising from beneath hills, proof of buried chapels. Modern digs have indeed uncovered collapsed churches beneath layers of soil, swallowed by landslides or floods. To a medieval ear, the faint groan of shifting earth was simply the hymn of a lost congregation, still singing in penance. The myths multiplied wherever ruins jutted from fields. Travelers stumbled on stone arches or half-buried walls overgrown with ivy. They insisted these were remnants of cursed cities struck down by God. Historians still argue whether these myths were moral lessons crafted by clerics or genuine folk memory of disasters. Either way, the ground kept secrets until archaeologists pried them open. You pass beneath an arch where carvings peek from the soil, faces worn smooth, eyes blind. In Britain, the myth of Lyonesse claimed an entire kingdom sank beneath the sea off Cornwall. Fishermen swore they heard church bells ringing below the waves. For centuries it was dismissed as legend, yet shifting sands and submerged forests off the coast gave hints of land once dry. Was Lyonesse myth, memory, or both? Quirky aside, some farmers finding walls beneath their fields blamed giants. Only a giant could have built such stonework, they muttered, turning ruins into myth. Others claimed buried cities were guarded by curses. In Italy, peasants avoided fields where ruins poked through, whispering that anyone who disturbed them would die. Modern archaeology found the sites harmless, except for the occasional snake coiled in the rubble. You chuckle. The curse of death by reptile surprise feels painfully literal. Historians still debate the myth of Troy. By the Middle Ages it was considered mostly allegory, not history. Then Heinrich Schliemann dug at Hisarlik in the 19th century and uncovered layers of cities, one of which matched Homer's tale. Suddenly, a myth turned back into fact. The lesson wasn't lost. When peasants whispered about vanished towns, sometimes they weren't inventing, they were remembering. Chamber opens wider, torchlight barely scratching its edges. Imagine standing in a medieval field, hearing hollow sounds when ploughing, or watching rain reveal patterns of stone under the soil. To the farmer, this was proof of a city buried alive. Some stories claimed the inhabitants still lived down there, trapped in eternal twilight, walking streets lit only by ghostly lanterns. Quirky note: in Denmark, legend told of a city swallowed for its pride. Excavations centuries later uncovered drowned settlements beneath lakes. While not literally punished by God, they were indeed victims of flooding. For the villagers who retold the tale, the myth was the only explanation they needed. Arrogance led to ruin. You crouch to study a carved well mouth rising from the dirt. Some myths insisted that if you shouted into such a well, voices answered from the buried city. Echoes of your own voice? Certainly. But imagine the chill when you heard words that didn't seem like yours. To a medieval child daring a friend at dusk, the myth was real enough. Historians still argue whether certain legends of vanished villages recorded memories of plague. Entire communities abandoned or erased in weeks might later be remembered as sunken or cursed. To those left behind, it felt as though the land itself had swallowed them. Myths preserved that grief when no other record remained. Your torch guttering low, you stand in silence. Beneath your feet lie centuries of lives, laughter, sorrow, now dust. The myths of buried cities weren't mere fantasy. They were memory's way of refusing erasure. And now archaeologists prove the peasants were right more often than skeptics admitted. The dead cities were real. The air stirs, carrying faint murmurs like wind through reeds. They sound almost like chanting. Prophets and seers have passed. Now you approach the myths of pilgrims, travelers said to walk impossible distances, their footsteps etched across Europe, leaving trails that astonishingly archaeology confirmed. You take a breath and step into the long roads of faith. The earth-scented chamber narrows into a long passage, its floor worn smooth, as if countless feet once traced the same path. You follow it, torchlight bouncing across faint carvings in the stone, scallop shells, crosses, and sandals etched into walls like graffiti left by travelers. These are the myths of endless pilgrims' footsteps, tales of holy men and women walking impossible distances, journeys so exaggerated they sounded like fiction. Yet archaeology has shown many of these routes were real, stamped into the soil by centuries of faith. The mainstream historical fact, pilgrimages were central to medieval life. Roads across Europe led to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, and Rome itself. Pilgrims carried badges, shells, and tokens proving their devotion. For centuries, myths grew around these journeys, that saints themselves had walked the paths, that stones glowed with miracles, that rivers parted for the faithful. You pause here, imagining the shuffle of thousands of boots, prayers whispered into the dust, myths born from exhaustion and hope. Quirky tidbit, scallop shells became the emblem of Santiago pilgrims, worn on hats and cloaks. Myths said the shell had miraculous powers, purifying water, warding off evil, even multiplying food like Christ's loaves. In reality, shells were practical cups for drinking on the road. But to a weary traveller who survived the journey, the myth was easier to believe than coincidence. The myths swelled wherever the pilgrim road bent. At Compostela, stories claimed the bones of St. James glowed with heavenly light, guiding pilgrims to his tomb. Excavations revealed an ancient Roman cemetery beneath the shrine, enough truth to root the myth. Historians still argue whether the relics really belonged to James, but the myth of the Field of Stars, Compostela, ensured the road thrived for centuries. You kneel beside an alcove where carvings of feet overlap like a crowd frozen in stone. Some myths said the very ground remembered each pilgrim. Medieval villagers swore they saw glowing footprints in the dust at night, proof that saints walked beside them, likely just phosphorescent fungi shining faintly. But when you're staggering by torchlight, the difference doesn't matter. Quirky aside, pilgrim badges, tiny pewter tokens, were sold at shrines. Some were shaped like swords, others like saints. But myths claimed the badges themselves healed sickness or protected against lightning. Archaeologists have found them buried in fields, slipped into graves, or tossed into rivers as offerings. Pilgrims didn't just wear their myths, they left them behind, planting them in soil and water like seeds of devotion. Historians still debate the tale of Canterbury pilgrims who claim to hear bells ringing in their ears as they approached the shrine of Thomas Becket. Some said it was divine music, others chalk it up to fatigue, hunger, or tinnitus. Yet when a whole group swore they heard the same sound, the myth gained permanence. You imagine trudging mile after mile, ears ringing, and deciding the bells were angels cheering you on. The road itself became mythic. Stories told of bridges that built themselves overnight, rivers that parted, and wolves that guided travelers through forests. Archaeology later confirmed that many pilgrim roads were lined with hospices, chapels, even carefully placed cairns to guide the lost. The myth of divine aid was often just human kindness, but in a dark wood at midnight, a candle in the window might as well be heaven. Quirky note, in some towns, pilgrims carved their names into stone walls. Myths claimed the letters glowed when the writer's soul reached heaven. Excavations show these carvings still exist, some worn down by centuries of touch. Whether glowing or not, they are proof that real footsteps passed here, myth solidified in stone. You let your torch lower, staring at the floor smoothed by invisible multitudes. The myths of pilgrims remind you that people wanted to believe their journeys mattered, that their suffering left a mark beyond blisters and hunger. And sometimes they were right, because centuries later, archaeologists still follow those trails. The footsteps fade in your ears, replaced by a softer sound, the hush of wind in high rafters like a sigh. You realize you've reached the end of the fortress journey. 20 myths have carried you through castles, swords, relics, giants, and buried cities. The story has stretched long into the night, and now the narrative itself must slow, soften, and close. So here you are, torch guttering low, the last embers of story curling like smoke around your ears. The fortress feels quiet now, not menacing, but calm, as though it too is ready for rest. You've walked through myths that once terrified peasants, that fueled kings and guided armies, that whispered from shadows and shone in banners. Yet what lingers is not fear, but the strange comfort that even myths carry pieces of truth. Let your breath slow, long, and steady. Imagine the stones beneath your back, cool and solid, supporting you after such a long journey. The air is softer now, carrying only the faint scent of dust and wax, the kind of smell that feels oddly safe, like an old library where time has stopped. The voices of saints, kings, witches, and giants fade gently, their echoes drifting higher into vaulted ceilings, where they dissolve into silence. Outside, the night stretches endlessly. Stars prick the sky like tiny candles, steady and patient. You realize that medieval eyes saw those same lights, weaving them into myths of dragons, omens, and gods. And yet, just like you, they must have leaned back at the end of a long day, breathing slowly, letting stories soothe them toward rest. Now your eyelids grow heavier. Each beat of your heart feels slower, calmer. The fortress no longer groans, it hums softly like a lullaby. You're safe here, wrapped in stone and story, cushioned by centuries of imagination. Myths have carried you far, but they leave you gently at the threshold of sleep. So let the torch finally burn out. Let the shadows fold over you like blankets, and as silence deepens, you drift quietly into dreams.